Welcome back to A Year of Final Fantasy, and we are starting a new month. We are starting the month of
Diablos.
and Final Fantasy V. Final Fantasy V is a special game for a few reasons, and because of those reasons, I've chosen to start this month's topic over remake and remastering efforts of the series. Before we get to that though, I always strive to have each month be a kind of unique presentation in its own way, and I'll be honest, it was really hard to find something that I was comfortable for with Final Fantasy V, but what you're seeing now is obviously what I decided to go with, and I wanted a kind of more mute background this time, and you'll notice that we also have another special box in the bottom corner. And that's because this month's special will be featuring a new set of jobs every video. Each week, I'll devote to a particular elemental crystal and the jobs that come from that crystal. Final Fantasy V is a very job-oriented game, so I couldn't ignore that fact. So the format is that I'll start with a very brief descriptor about the job and what it is, and then about halfway through the video, I'll introduce another job and briefly talk about that before we finish out the video. So think of this as a sort of mini job video month, with every video having just a little bit of jobs to it. So let's get started. Our first job here is going to be the Freelancer, and it's simply a job that can pretty much equip anything, but doesn't really have any kind of special abilities to speak of. Now, onto the topic. I wanted to address the remakes and remastering efforts of the series at large, and due to the sheer massive amount of remasters and remakes, we'll be tackling this in chunks like we do our jobs video and our summons video and I guess commercial video, and yeah, we do this a lot actually. So we're going to be focusing on Final Fantasy 1 through 6 remasters and remakes in this particular episode. Much of the remasters, at least for the West, started during the PS1 era. Final Fantasy games at this point were notoriously difficult to come by and extremely expensive otherwise, and honestly not much has changed in reference to those initial system releases. However, Square saw this and began efforts to redistribute the games on the PlayStation to allow a wider audience than they may have before, especially the PlayStation being the new console that they were going to support rather than Nintendo, and they wanted to get some new and possibly different people, maybe some of the Sega people that never really bought into the Nintendo systems. The first real promotion of these earlier games come in the form of Final Fantasy Anthology for the PlayStation 1, which combined Final Fantasy V and 6, and this is an incredibly huge milestone in the series for the West. The reasons are that this was the first time Final Fantasy V had an official release in the US. It never came to us on the Super Nintendo as it did in Japan, but again, we'll talk about all of that whenever we get to Final Fantasy V itself. Second is this monumental occasion that blew open the doors, settling the naming conflicts with the Western and Eastern games. At this point, Final Fantasy III was now finally known as Final Fantasy VI. And as the success of Final Fantasy Anthology reached the masses, we got another similar bundle with Final Fantasy IV and Chrono Trigger, known as Final Fantasy Chronicles. Final Fantasy IV had now followed in the footsteps of 6, basically erasing the idea of Final Fantasy II and what that means in the States. Now it was Final Fantasy IV the world over. And several changes were made to the game, with the easy mode that we got to see in Final Fantasy II Super Nintendo over here being removed. Final Fantasy IV also got some new bells and whistles, like a computer cinematic opening and other various cinematic scenes throughout the game, which actually still persist in many of the releases of Final Fantasy IV today. Final Fantasy IV was also a more direct port of the original game that released in Japan. Like I said, it had the easy mode stuff removed, and it also was a more faithful adaptation to the script that was originally in Japan. Like I said, Final Fantasy Chronicles also had Chrono Trigger with it, and Chrono Trigger and Chrono Cross are some of my most important games in my life, so I'm not going to talk about them here because they aren't Final Fantasy, but I do want to give a nod to them, because they're a very special series to many people. Anyway, with the success of Chronicles, Final Fantasy Origins followed soon after, using the Final Fantasy WonderSwan Color remasters. I did talk about the WonderSwan and my Final Fantasy commercials video just very briefly, but essentially what it was a portable system in Japan that could boast some Super Nintendo level graphics. Think of like a Game Boy Advance. With that, we also got Final Fantasy II as well as 1, and this is notable as it's the first official release of Final Fantasy II in the West, the real Final Fantasy II. So now we have all of the Final Fantasy naming schemes wiped away by all of these new remasters and re-releases on the PlayStation, which is so good. It's so very welcome. And like I said before, I just want to take a brief little second to mention the next class that I want to talk about in Final Fantasy V, and that is the Knight. And the Knight is basically exactly what you would expect. He is the analog to the fighter in the original game. So these first few jobs that you're going to see very much mirror the original 6 jobs in the original Final Fantasy. So the Knight, very cool, hard-hitting kind of character. Not much to him, but hey, it's the Knight. What else can you expect? So jumping back, we have Final Fantasy re-releases on the PlayStation 1. We got all of this new content. It kind of settled down everything. So let's talk about what happened after the PlayStation 1 releases. And we saw this with Origins, actually, pairing up to arrive on the Game Boy Advance, which sported the subtitle moniker Dawn of Souls, which added a few little special bonus areas, but was essentially just a port of the Final Fantasy 1 and 2 that we saw in the original PlayStation. Final Fantasy 4 also made its way to the Game Boy Advance in a similar fashion with other releases, and I've talked all about those in the Final Fantasy 4 video. It came out on DS, PSP, mobile, and Steam, and like I said, I had talked all about those in the other video, so I'm just gonna skip that right now. If you want to see that, definitely check that video out. And finally, as you might guess, Final Fantasy VI followed a similar treatment on the Game Boy Advance, but as of this recording, it never got a 3D remake in the vein of Final Fantasy IV or 3 on the DS. And Square has actually taken notice of this in the recent years with the new remakes that they're trying to do with Final Fantasy VII, and they've actually commented that they would like to go back and see what they could do with Final Fantasy VI. Now, 7 is on the mind of everyone, and we're not going to touch that in this particular video right now because that is a whole other can of worms to open, but it is interesting that they have acknowledged that Final Fantasy VI hasn't really got as much love as you would expect, considering that it is one of the most loved games in the franchise by the majority of people that enjoy Final Fantasy. And with Final Fantasy III, there's not a whole lot to mention about that I already didn't address in the Final Fantasy III video. We just never, for whatever reason, got that game until very recently in the grand scheme of things. So Final Fantasy III, I do want to mention it because it did get the remaster. It's just, I've talked about it ad nauseum on the Final Fantasy III video. Before we shut this whole thing down though, I'd like to draw special attention to a recent set of remasters that found their way onto mobile and Steam platforms. These particular platforms have seen remasters of Final Fantasy V and VI, but they've been horribly panned by most longtime fans of the franchise, with sloppy high-definition textures, which kind of sounds like an oxymoron, but the sprites that they've remade, along with a slew of other features, taking what is essentially the challenge and the heart out of these games. And I'll completely admit that I'm biased on that front. I don't like these remakes at all, and the ideas that went into them. It's just a shame that those are the games that newcomers to the franchise are going to play because they're the most easily accessible now. It's just a shame. If you can, please go and try and find any other version of any of those games. Don't give your money to these Steam and mobile versions. They're just shoddy ports of a truly masterful game. They look like thrown together Flash games, for lack of a better word. Anyway, those are most of the big highlights that I wanted to talk about on this particular video. Of course, there are a slew more of remasters, remakes, and more recent versions of the games, but we'll tackle those later. Believe me, there are a ton of things that those games bring to the table that would make this particular episode probably, 45 minutes long. So we're gonna split it up. Well, with that being said, next time on the month of
Diablos,
we will be talking about one of the most hated and reviled Final Fantasy games to have ever been created. And yes, if you guessed Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, you are right. But as always, if you enjoy what I do here, please feel free to share this, maybe even sub. Regardless, I thank you so much, as always, for watching this video. And of course, until next time, Crystal Warriors, keep on gaming.